Welcome everyone to the fourth brown bag lunch lecture series of the Institute of African Studies for 2021. My name is Dominique Marshall. I'm a historian affiliated with the Institute at Carleton University. It's a pleasure today to welcome Rebecca Shepard, who is trained in anthropology, art history, and history. Rebecca is talking to us from Birmingham, where in the United Kingdom, where she was trained in the UK in history at the University of Liverpool first, and then at the University of East Anglia in the arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. This is also where she did her PhD on the topic that she is talking about today. And her presentation is part of her own work to revise some of that material for publication. So she was glad to share it with us. She will speak of the history of an encounter between the collectioner and anthropologist, early anthropologist Emil Torday during an expedition in the Congo in the early 1900s. Rebecca visited the Institute last year, came to a brown bag series, and when I asked her by chance what she working on, she was working on Emil Torday. And what do you know? I knew Emil Torday. He had been at the conference on the, he had been helping to prepare the conference on the African child of the League of Nations and the Save the Children Fund, on which I'd been working in 1931. So I mean, nobody knows Emil Torday that I know, but there she was. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to have her. Also because the relationship between the Institute and anthropology is deep and long lasting. And the way that she mixes this art history and museum studies, I'm sure will please you all. The way we will do is in 2 minutes, Rebecca will appear and give her presentation for 30 minutes. Meanwhile, the chat box will be open on the right-hand side of your screen. You just push the little chat button at the bottom. You can comment as it's happening. That will not be on the recording. We're recording that session. And you tell me if you have a question. You can either write the question and I will convey it to Rebecca, or when the question time arrive at 1:35, I will call you and you can show up on the video if you wish. Otherwise, I'll convey your question. Her presentation will stop after half an hour and we'll have 25 minutes, half an hour of questions so that you can go back to whatever it is you're doing right after the hour mark, because this is a lunch talk. This is recorded. If you ever want our technician to edit out your intervention later, write to him. Femi is our technician today. Thank you very much. He's, if you have any problem, you can also write to him personally in the chat box and he will help you solve technical problems. So thank you very much to you all for being there, and up to you, Rebecca.
I'm going to be talking about the Emil Torday expedition, as Dominique said, and it was a great coincidence to meet Dominique, who randomly had heard of Emil Torday through her work on Save the Children International, so that was lovely. Okay, so Torday was a Hungarian explorer that was sent as an envoy from the British Museum in 1907 to 1909. He collected the first and largest collection of Congolese artefacts in the UK for the British Museum. Alone, he collected 3,000 artefacts. 182 of these artefacts at the British Museum are from the region that we're going to be looking at today in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We'll zoom in shortly on the area and one particular encounter involving the use of a clockwork elephant whilst crossing the part of the country that was yet to be mapped by Europeans, despite the fact that this area as a whole, now modern day DRC, was occupied by King Leopold of Belgium and then annexed by the country of Belgium in 1908, halfway through this expedition. Okay. So was this elephant seen as magical or even medicinal equipment by local people in the Kasai? So we'll be exploring this through a number of questions today that we'll keep coming back to. The first being what makes things medicinal or magical. And why are these two categories grouped together? Did Torday have enough knowledge locally to achieve these aims? What do the terms fetish and medicine in Hilton Simpson, that's Torday's companion, in his work obscure or reveal about the relationships involving objects in the region? And does Torday's use of regional terminology obscure practices that evade foreign categories? And were Europeans seen to have their own magic in the Kasai? Emil Torday was born in 1875, and then in green here I've just highlighted a few key dates from the colonial era. So Emil Torday had already been to the Congo in 1900, and he stayed there until 1904, where he spent time among the Luba peoples. And while he had limited duties for the colonial government, he did learn the language, now a lingua franca, in DRC of Chaluba. He returned to Britain, where he met Joyce and engaged with ethnographic networks of London at the time. Torday's next post in Africa was in the Kasai for 2 years for the concession company, the Compagnie de Kasai, in 1904 and 1906. This is where Torday began to correspond with Joyce at the British Museum about local cultures and languages alongside his commercial duties. This was standard practice for missionaries and others that worked for and within the colonial apparatus at the time. Even those with no scientific background or training in the growing disciplines of social sciences often held valuable knowledge of languages, and much data was sent back to the growing ethnographic museums of Europe and the Americas. Torday was in Congo at a horrendous moment in its colonial history. The Congo Free State had been King Leopold's private dominion until it was annexed by Belgium in 1908, largely due to the huge amount of international criticism surrounding the atrocities carried out relating to violent trade in red rubber. Torday left his post for the Compagnie de Kasai for ethical reasons, as he told Joyce in a letter in 1906, because of his reporting of an agent for murdering local peoples, and this was ignored by a director of the concession company. His superiors, the agents of the Belgian concession company working within King Leopold's Free State, were dissatisfied and somewhat suspicious of Torday that he was sending objects back to the British Museum and other UK museums rather than to Taverne in Belgium, which later became the Royal Museum of Central African Arts. Torday returned to the UK and tried to find a post working for the British colonial government, but was convinced by Joyce to go back in 1907 to the Kasai region with the sole purpose of making collections and documenting the cultures of the Kasai region in southwest central Democratic Republic of Congo. Hilton Simpson, on the left there, was Torday's companion, a gentleman from rural Kent, who was connected with the Powell Cottons, explorers of Angola, with their own museum, which is still there. It's a great museum, and just a few miles from Hilton Simpson's estate. They spent 2 years in the Congo between 1907 and 1909 and travelled 600 miles into the interior of Africa. This time, Torday had no commercial duties and could concentrate solely on making collections, transcribing and recording languages, and following the other scientific objectives of the Notes and Queries questionnaire. Torday's data, largely positivist and empirical, was sent back to Thomas Althall Joyce at the British Museum, along with the vast collections and thousands of photographs. We're just having a quick look here at a modern day map from 2011, just to orient ourselves slightly. And this is a map from the expedition. In the square there, you can see the area that we'll be zooming in on shortly. So you can see here that Torday's collections were distributed far and wide across the museums of Europe. There are over 3,000 in the British Museum alone, and 1,500 field photographs. There were thousands more field photographs, but these were burnt in a fire in 1941. So there were several thousand taken in the field. The Pitt Rivers Museum, as well as the British Museum, has a substantial collection, and Torday's hometown of Budapest in the Department of Ethnography, where the curator has done a considerable amount of work on Emil Torday. Also, they have 400 artefacts. There are a few more examples scattered around Europe, but also the Americas. I've left off the list, actually. There are a few items in a museum in Los Angeles, and Torday did a brief stint at the University Museum of Philadelphia, where he also curated and catalogued the collection of Leo Frobenius, who was his contemporary and travelled around the Kasai region just before Torday in 1906. They met while Torday was working for the concession company, and other parts of West Africa. He published prolifically and has his own institute in Frankfurt. So Torday's list of publications, numbering well over 50, as well as reviewers of his own work, reveal his contemporaneous impact among scientific networks at the time in the UK and the Americas. Torday's opinion was called upon in the ethnographic journals of the time to review works by people such as Northcote Thomas and make contributions to the works of the botanist, explorer and linguist Harry Johnston. Torday's work was also read by important scholars at the time who reviewed his own work, especially his more scholarly contributions to the field of African anthropology, co-authored with Joyce at the museum. One of these reviewers is worked on Northwest Coast art, Franz Boas, very famed in the Americas. This slide shows some of the more popular works that will inform a large part of our discussion today. They largely fall into the genre defined by Freed as colonial travel guides, where they instructed Europeans about how to behave. The low numbers of colonial personnel in Central Africa, Freed tells us, meant that every European in Africa, whether they were botanists, traders, explorers, scientists, or anything else, had to uphold certain European moral and legal standards. As we will see, Torday's accounts were furnished with detail of indigenous practices and terminology that gave Europeans a newfound insight into the workings of power and social relations in a local context. In the Kasai, these social relations involved objects. Okay. As we will see today, Torday's fieldwork and in-depth knowledge of African cultures and practices demonstrate the origins of an anthropological approach to objects. This experience, both commercial, pragmatic and practical, as much as scientific and systematically positivist, was later developed into some profound theoretical insights that developed into Torday's later works in the 20s and 30s. Torday reviewed a number of African art surveys that were emerging in the 1930s, stating that they solely looked at the aesthetics of the objects, that is, their physical appearance only, in many cases. Torday writes a review, for example, of Van Sydow, where he writes, quote, "Technique, execution and shape are trammelled by tradition and vary according to the emotions of the finished object. The emotions the finished object is intended to arouse." End quote. This point, writes John Mack in 1990, was Torday's largest theoretical input into anthropology. That is, a starting point for the anthropology of art, which was lost from the mainstay of the discipline. Torday did not fall into the theoretical schools of functionalism or the diffusionist approaches which were taken up by British anthropology, particularly by Malinowski. All this despite the fact that Malinowski wrote Torday's obituary and commended his international impact in African studies and his humanitarian work that Dominique Marshall mentioned earlier. Torday notes that a block to an anthropological approach to art in language and categories available at the time. In an article entitled Le fétichisme, l'idolâtrie et la sorcellerie des Bantus occidentaux, published by Anthropologie in 1929. Torday, before analysing objects, classed magical devices and ancestral sculptures from the Lower Congo, and he puts forward regional Bantu ideas for the nature of spirits and animating forces. This is something we're going to come back to today. At this very early point, explains Mack, that's John Mack, Torday actually points out that the terms fetish and idol have been a hindrance to the understanding of art, and reflects their role in Indigenous contexts. In Torday's review of Rattray, Religion, Art and Ashanti, published in Man, the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. Hence, in Torday's fieldwork practices, as we will see, he employs Indigenous terminology that helps us reconstruct local experiences and power relations within a colonial setting. It links up his empirical fieldwork and his later theoretical work. As we can see here, anthropological approaches to art were not taken up until the 1980s. Some of this was taken up in the 1970s when John Mack took his post at the British Museum, and there are some mentions from these decades onwards of Torday in the journal African Arts. John Mack's exhibition in 1990, Emil Torday and the Art of the Congo, and his accompanying book at the Museum of Mankind rekindled an interest in Torday as a figure in his own right. Shilcout and Klein published a volume that linked colonialism, anthropology and art, where Torday featured in 2 chapters. In 1998, after 8 years after John had made the point that Torday initiated the theoretical discussion in the anthropology of art, Alfred Gell's seminal work, Art and Agency, offered us a global theory to explore art from all cultures. Gell's criticism of the discussions of art of non-Western cultures that it was not anthropological enough and should instead focus on social relations on a micro scale, without perpetuating the traditional opposition between functional objects typically assigned to non-Western art and aesthetically pleasing objects typically associated with canonical art from the West. Both Western and non-Western art, according to Gell, can be regarded in an anthropological sense by focusing on the technical aptitude required for its production, which enchants the viewer, with the objects themselves functioning as social agents in a matrix of relational networks. Perhaps we may note that this perspective is enticingly similar to Emil Torday's explanation of the emotions aroused by the finished objects cited above in his review of Rattray. Torday did not define these animating forces or agency as something that made these objects art at the time, but he did collapse together categories of ritual, medicine, and other social functions by using Indigenous terminology. So I wanted to look at the fieldwork process in my thesis as a historian, which is what I looked at in my thesis entitled A History of Encounter and Encounter with History. I focused on a specific area, the Lele, the Kuba Bushong, and I used a new source which hadn't been looked at in any previous discussions or scholarly works about Emil Torday, which was his unpublished account of the expedition. This is a fantastic source that's helped me reconstruct in great detail Torday's methodology and also the topography of the photographs and expedition. Okay, so just back to the map again here. So we're looking at the final stage of the expedition in 1909 among the Lele people. The expedition travelled through the Kasai for 2 years, as we can see on this map of the region. So they went up the Kasai River, the Sankore River here, into Bateke country, marched back down, came down here towards Lusambo, came back up, spent 2 or 3 months in the royal Kuba Bushong capital here, Mushenge, came down this way, travelled back to where Torday had previously been a concession company worker among the Pende and the Umbala. Torday spoke fluent Kimbala as well. And then they crossed over here before returning home. The final stop on the expedition was among the Lele, who lived between the Luange and the Kasai rivers and were yet to be visited directly by a European. The heroic venture into supposedly terra incognita was given much emphasis in the British press and in the popular accounts of the journey by Hilton Simpson and Emil Torday. The area was yet to be mapped, and the Lele and Wango peoples who resided there had a reputation as hostile towards Europeans. They were known only from the peripheries of these lands along the river. In this 1905 ethnographic map of the region sent to Joyce by Torday, the Lele are not featured. They were known to the Belgian authorities, as can be seen in this 1901 map of the factories. So I've put an arrow there, which points to Dumba, which is the nearest trade post to the Lele. However, this had been burnt down and then reconstructed by the time the expedition members went back. The factory of Benelluide, which is further north, had also been burnt down on a number of occasions. So there were many violent encounters between the Lele and the colonial authorities before Torday arrived. Torday requested to Joyce at the British Museum that an elephant, a toy elephant, be sent over from the Kasai, and they picked up 2 in Dima, the trade post. They were purchased for 2 or 3 pence at Hamley's toy shop in London. The elephant was displayed on numerous occasions, and one was sold on the periphery of Lele country. It was, however, in the very interior of Lele country that the elephant was reported by Torday and Hilton Simpson to have saved their lives, and as Hilton Simpson put it, prevented a massacre without the use of guns or violence. This is something that Torday particularly emphasised, was crossing without any atrocities, and he uses the words atrocities frequently in his publications. In the village of Kenge, the expedition had run out of the only commodity for which they could engage local people in porterage services as guides to the next village, to get them closer to their destination of the Kasai River on the other side, or even to purchase food, chickens, or to buy artefacts. We can see here that this commodity was iron bars, extremely heavy and expensive to carry and very valuable. This was the costliest, yet one of the shortest parts of the expedition. As they moved further inland towards their destination of the Kasai River, they reached the village of Kenge, where things took a turn for the worse and local people were getting ready to see off the expedition, circling the expedition members with bows and arrows ready to shoot at them. In Kenge, Hilton Simpson reports that the villagers were hostile and that the display of the elephant turned hostilities not into friendliness but into fear. According to Hilton Simpson's accounts, the villagers were apparently so scared of the elephant that they agreed to give them food and wanted them to leave their village to get their dangerous so-called fetish away. Stryther used Hilton Simpson's Land of Peoples of the Kasai account published in 1911, and this incident in particular in Kenge, to support her extremely well-founded argument that European technologies such as the camera, the phonograph recorder, etc., were just part of this practice of Europeans under the guise of science, portraying themselves as wizards and sorcerers, while local populations were unlikely, in fact, to see this as anything other than novel representational practice, if anything. An antithesis between science and magic was the cornerstone of European colonial identity, according to Tausig and Stryther, and patronising unequal power relationships. As Stryther points out, the elephant in Kenge was displayed on a case of guns. While Stryther has not consulted Hilton Simpson's unpublished 7-volume diary, which explains this interaction in detail, the unpublished account in fact makes the link between guns and the elephant all the more explicit to further underscore Stryther's point. I now quote from Hilton Simpson's unpublished diary here. The chief of Kenge was then shown the elephant secretly in Torday's tent. He entered the tent, and as soon as he was in, he jumped out backwards with a little squeak and then stood with staring eyes, wagging his tongue. He was then induced to look again, but he would not stay more than a few seconds and hurried off to the village saying, quote, "I'll fix those chickens." A little later, the old aggressive chief came along and T talked straight to him and pointed out how Bula Matadi would come to fetch us and how we did not care whether there was war or not. T remarked to one chap, "I sleep, but the elephant never sleeps," and wagged his finger in his face. This had a capital effect, though it nearly made us both burst with suppressed laughter. T then burnt some grass over burning whiskey. It being daylight, the fire on the spirit was invisible till the grass caught light. This too was most nerve-shattering for the old aggressive chief. He brought back the chickens, and again T told him straight what a to-do there would be if anyone tried to interfere with us. Thus, for the village of Kenge, where the elephant was seen to save the expedition members, I completely agree with Zoe Streifer's analysis of the same incident, that Torday, if anything, was presenting himself as a depraved sorcerer, if anything at all, a conscienceless killer who, like the Pendé sorcerers did in later decades, sent out miniature robots to conduct their crimes. Upon reading these particular accounts of the clockwork elephant, one is especially dubious that the clockwork elephant was anything other than a bizarre practice. Seen as anything other than a bizarre practice, this was especially the case in Kenge. However, I believe that the reference made to Bula Matadi, violence and colonialism only further serves to illustrate another point. This link to violence and colonialism does not need to obscure the potential connections and links made to the metaphysical universe by items of foreign manufacture to foreigners as practitioners or practices resembling those used by local practitioners of divination, or sometimes called witchcraft. So Streifer's notion that the clockwork elephant was associated with violence is all the more resonant in a region that had already experienced the full might of European trade, violence and power. Thus, with little language in the region, Torday's mention of Bula Matadi is likely to have been the only term understood, if anything. Moreover, the unpublished account leaves even more of an impression about the association of violence with this elephant. In fact, the explorer Stanley's local appellation meaning breaker of rocks. It means breaker of rocks, sorry. Stanley crossed the Congo on behalf of King Leopold and created the International Africa Association. This was the trip that set in motion the annexation of Congo at the Brussels Conference in 1885 to King Leopold, his private dominion named the Congo Free State. Stanley used dynamite to remove rocky obstacles obstructing his journeys, thus gaining the nickname Bula Matadi. This became a lingua franca term across what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo for all Europeans. As much as Europeans homogenized, diverse and multilingual Congolese populations, Congolese populations also grouped together diverse international foreigners from the Americas and Europeans, traders, colonialists, administrators and explorers under this one term. While this area was portrayed as unknown to Europeans by Torday and Hilton Simpson, the Lele people had spent decades in violent interactions with Europeans, fighting against territorial occupation on the borders of their country. Trade posts, while not in Lele country, were on the edges. The trade posts of Dumba to the left and Beneluidi to the north, and the huge administrative posts, trading and mission station of Basongo were only a few days walk away from the village of Kenge. There's a little bit of a delay here, sorry. Ali. Okay. So, as I was saying, the trade posts are not very far, and they're certainly not a great distance by Congolese standards in terms of trading. These distances were rendered especially shorter by the extremely mobile Tchok trading middlemen that had moved into Congo in small bands of traders with their own trading posts scattered from the west to east coast. This area is also on the border of modern-day Angola to the south, where Tchok traders had moved in small groups and integrated into Congolese populations, thus moving the Lele into global trade networks and the transatlantic slave trade from the west coast, as well as trade with Eastern Swahili on the east. Coupled with this, the territorial threats from the gun-clad Tchok traders, slave raiders and ivory traders were witnessed by Torday and they're noted in the unpublished sources but not in the published sources. We might say that later colonial trading systems in this region were barely ever territorial in any case. Even after Torday's expedition, when the Lele country had been mapped for the first time, trade with Europeans, British and Belgians was in any case never really conducted within the borders of the rivers throughout the entire colonial period. As such, the Lele never really had trade posts in their own country, where palm kernels were collected by lorries in later years for the palm oil plantations and factories owned by Lord Lever of Lever Soap Industries, now Leverhulme, in the areas surrounding Lele country, but not within these borders. And this has been documented by the Lele anthropologist Mary Douglas. Van Seeners claimed thus that exploitation came later in the Kasai after 1910, and that this region was exempt from the worst atrocities of King Leopold's Congo Free State is also incorrect when all of these violent interactions and long distance trade in the longue durée are taken into account. Torday, at the very least, compared to other criminals in the Kasai, was relatively better behaved and made legitimate purchases and so on. However, he called in the wider might of Bula Matadi, threatened violence, and knew how to make associative visual and material links with broader systemic violence and power of the colonial apparatus in the interaction, as the interaction in Kenge shows. With this term, and with Europeans and the Bajok, the Lele was certainly familiar with its destructive forces. As we can see here on this slide, another visual link is made to Europeans and magical practices. You might note the distinctive hat on this man's head. And notice the caption as well, that he's a wizard, well versed in the art of divining, casting spells for good or evil, and detecting witches. In any case, we have further evidence, visual or otherwise, from the Torday sources that Torday knew exactly how to associate objects with networks of power in a local sense, at times very deliberately and somewhat scientifically, and at times accidentally through his pragmatic and practical background in conducting trade. In the Hilton-Simpson sources in particular, but the Torday sources too, the terms fetish and medicine are used interchangeably to describe indigenous practices relating to objects and magic, and sometimes ironically to refer to Western medicine administered by Europeans in their duties as doctors. Okay, so we can see just a few examples here, there are plenty more. So, in order to make this link between medicine, terms like fetish, witchcraft, divination, and so on, we have to look at the cultural construction of medicine and disease. In that part of the cure for disease, as outlined in the paper you can see on the right there, is divination, thus requiring the object that you can see in the photograph there is a divination board, an itombwe from the Lele region, that is used to cure diseases. However, a disease that is cognitively puzzling, that is with a non-natural cause, is used to solve a multitude of problems or afflictions. Ngokpe also points out that causes and cures of disease are sorcery, and the cures are both treatment and divination practices. So we can see some of these divination boards here in the Torday collection. This one being from the Kuba and Gendi region. They're distributed around the Kasai. Torday in 1908 loses a knife and witnesses these itombwe in practice. Hilton-Simpson describes them as fetish. Torday and Hilton-Simpson describe them as medicine. Torday doesn't use the word fetish, and in 1925 Torday refers to them by their proper term, by their indigenous term, itombwe. Okay, so there's another example here. Among the Wango and Lele, they are normally in the shape of animals, so they represent animals. And the device that you can see on the side, in this case, is woven from basketry, but it's rubbed by the diviner back and forth in order to resolve problems, disputes, cure ailments, and generally, I like to call them problem-solving devices. You can see another one here. This one is in the shape, it has a Janus face, which represents looking out and seeking out, which is part of the object's functionality as well. So illness, which is culturally constructed, requires divine intervention from metaphysical planes through a specialised practitioner, object or substance with a metonymic connection. Metonymy is the use of a material to stand in for a concept or person. It can be seen in this item of divinatory equipment from the Torday collection, perhaps one of the most revealing items across the entire collection in this sense. The other items, sculpted into crocodile shapes or with Janus faces seeking out, thus seem to go beyond notions of representation and rather into the realms of something like Gel's social agents, intermediaries in themselves. Okay. So they harness the material that they're made with, harnesses the power and properties of what it is they're trying to contact in either the physical or metaphysical world, and the distinction between those two planes is less acute than it would be in general. So Torday did garner some understanding of the way in which objects worked in this sense, something that went beyond form and function. And he did this in the early years through the term Kasai. So Alan Roberts, the art historian of the Eastern Congo, describes Kasai as a Congolese wide concept that will just help us to understand the way in which objects work and the way in which Torday understood them. So Kasai is not generally reified or spoken about overtly, and he's talking about for the tabwa in Eastern Congo. And the word Kasai refers more to the vehicle and conveyance of potentialities for which people at Luanda have vague descriptors, like Nguvu, which refers to strength, power, authority, and force, and Uwezo, meaning strength, might, power, capacity, authority, ability, and faculty. Such a sense of occult force merges with notions of medicines and practices of the ambivalent arts of Bolozi, the activities of witchcraft. So Torday makes many references and uses the term Kasai intermittently with the terms medicine and fetish, and he attempts to describe it on many occasions. At times he associates it with a form and a substance, which is a white powder or a clay. Again, this has a metonymic reference. It refers to ancestors, and the clay is taken from the rivers where the spirits in Gesh reside. Torday writes, for example, that those coming back from the dead have a powerful Kasai. Every family has a store of this which has been inherited. And his friend who carved objects, Lele, who made many of the objects in the British Museum, he died. On the second morning, though, he sat up and called for bread and palm wine. The people assured him that he was dead and couldn't eat, but that he threatened to kill them, so they did what he wanted. He then disappeared and entered the body of an elephant, but 2 months later the animal was killed, and Lele on the self-same day reappeared in the village and lives there to this day. So after his death, Meleme's life force, or something similar, his Kasai, turned into a Kasai which assisted others in war to become invisible or disappear. Okay. So these are some other examples of medicinal / divinatory problem solving objects. So it is important to us to note that in this region, disease and illness are not necessarily physical, thus their cure and cause lie within the practice of sorcery as well as non-bodily problems. Something Enderland's work on the Lele disease etiology makes clear. Thus, practitioners of medicine were also powerful leaders with the ability to convey power from other dimensions that could both cure and cause any ailments that had a cognitively puzzling origin. In a remarkable extension of this notion of Kasai in his later work on the trail of the Bushongo, which is a mix of both popular stories and accounts of the expedition in 1907 and 1909, as well as some more theoretical insights into the role of objects and art. So in this work on the trail of the Bushongo, Torday displays an intricate knowledge, further still, of the various distinctions between the forces, between life forces. So roughly translated as the soul, but Torday makes distinctions between 3 different types of soul. It's too lengthy to go into here. It'd be like trying to describe the difference between the Brahman and Atman or something in Hinduism. But Torday explains that there is a sort of soul, which is a divine ancestor, a second ethereal self, the Edo, and a shadow that can depart and return whilst asleep and resides in an animal after death, as we saw in the previous account, to be killed by the person's closest ancestor. Torday describes and witnesses this, which we saw above. So his energy then lived on and becomes a Kasai or something similar, a life force that is injected or put into objects through metonymic reference. There is another element beyond all of this, writes Torday in 1925, Mondwa, the spirit of evil, which resides in some people who are witches or wizards. After their death, writes Torday, the Mondwa wanders and causes accidents and disease. The best way to lay it is to dig up the bones of the deceased and burn them. That colonialism or bula matadi had caused so much disruption to the metaphysical as well as physical universe, or just the natural order, and its wandering Mondwa, or to take the regional lingua franca term that generalizes all of this, Kasai, perhaps had resided in many forms, even a mechanical elephant. I'm happy to take your questions when you're ready.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Rebecca, for this extraordinary tour de force there. There is already one question from Amelia. I'll read it unless Amelia wants to come on video. Amelia, would you like to show up, or are you happy for me to read it? Okay. She says, I was wondering if today, if Torday and Simpson left any account of their acquisitions of Lele divination objects. Do you have any sense of how readily these objects were exchanged compared to other ethnographic items, which may have been conceived as less powerful and more readily exchanged? What might it have meant for the Lele to have given divination items to Torday's expedition?
Oh, okay. So it's more about what was sold and what wasn't, I suppose, in value. Yeah, there are actually really precise records of the amounts that practitioners were paid in the country, with regional variations given to currency as well. So there's one account of the divination boards with Itombwe being used for between 1,000 and 4,000 Djembu, which were, you know, that was a few £100s. So there's a great variety in the different levels of divination. There's also an instance where Torday refused to sell the clockwork elephant itself in the neighbouring region, somebody wanted to pay 2 ivory tusks and 2 slaves for the elephant, but Torday refused that. So there are a tremendous amount of records of values and variations within them. I think that answers the question more or less. So yes, is the short answer. There's lots of records of that.
I forgot to ask to tell that before, but when you do ask a question, if you want to introduce you a little, where you are and where you and your affiliation, that would be lovely. So Joanne Lay is asking, out of curiosity, did the diviner manage to help Torday find his knife?
No, he didn't.
Okay, so
but Torday said he wouldn't let that ruin his admiration for the practice.
okay, so this event is scheduled until 2:30. We'll try to finish around 2:15. We have a good 25 minutes for questions and conversation, and Joanne is writing good on him about the last question. So I'll say a few things, Rebecca, and then maybe you can comment on them. First of all, I was struck with the similarities with an explorer collector that a master student in my department is working on, George Comer, who was a whaler, and he was sent by the Smithsonian to collect stuff amongst Inuits in Canada at a similar period. So he used his knowledge of the language, his trading connections, to do very much like Torday. He also had, like him, a strong sense of the importance of indigenous words and of the ethics of relationships between him and the people he encountered. And so it was interesting to see how Torday explicitly distanced himself from the commercial adventures that he was part of, which were, as you said, and is well known, extremely violent. The other thing is that you do, I forgot to say that when I introduced you, work teaching online school children about history. And you showed us that Torday in all his audiences was doing some popular work. And so there's, you're probably more sensitive to that aspect of his work this way. And I was wondering if you have any sense of is the reception, the popular reception of his work. And I know it's a hard one to document, and in particular, maybe if you do, of the role of his understanding of medicine and magic and all this. I would also like you to repeat the name of the museum of the fellow Hilton who worked with him. I missed on this. And the last thing, my last comment, and I saw in your pictures that you actually went there, since there's a picture taken by you, and maybe you could tell us a little about how going there might have influenced the way that you're talking about all this now. Thanks.
Okay, so it's an interesting connection with George Comer, was it? Yeah, and that plight for more detailed language is very much linked, I know in the UK, with the colonial project, where it was needed and set out. And Harry Johnston, whose work Torday reviewed, set out to do just this and did work for the colonial government. So there's a really strong link there between those two things. In terms of the popular reception of Torday's work, he gave a number of lectures in the UK. I don't know anything about really readership figures or anything of the books, but it was more colonial audiences really, and I think that colonial travel guide really summarizes quite well that genre. He gave lectures around the UK to British entrepreneurs like Lord Lever. He went up to Liverpool and so on. So there are a few lantern slides and things that we can look at in order to gauge that. The Illustrated London News reported a considerable amount about the expedition. That had a large weekly readership, and it was quite a cheap visual publication. So it had a sort of curiosity surrounding it. The British Museum, of course, was open to the public, so the objects were displayed. In 1910, Torday sent artefacts to the colonial exhibition in Belgium. So again, it fed straight into the Belgian colonial structure there. So there was an audience there too. I was going to say one more thing about that. Yeah, that's passed me by. And then your second question was relating to, remind me. And the third question. Oh, about children you asked, didn't you, as well? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I made a connection with what you were doing for larger
Yeah.
audiences, but...
Interestingly, though, I did, there are a lot of artifacts that are called toys in the collection, and they're normally sort of miniature and things like that. But there are also some really lovely photographs of children in Africa engaging with Torday, wearing his hat and so on, and beards on their faces and dressing up as Europeans. And Torday did seem quite fond of children. He also left a really beautiful book that was never published about folklore, which was a bunch of stories, and the preface is dedicated to his daughter. They were interned in their house during the First World War, and his daughter was disabled. She had disabilities caused by polio, and he said that he was inspired to write the tales down because it kept them going really during their version of lockdown, I suppose. So he enjoyed talking about Africa and telling tales. She became an author in her own right, a fiction author, and she wrote one book in 1938 called Mirror of the Sun, which has the main character Simon. And Mirror of the Sun is a quote from Torday's 1913 Camp and Tramp in the African Wilds. So he had this kind of like romantic vision of Africa, and he definitely wanted to go back there. I think with him working on the Save the Children International in 1930, just before he died, I think he was picking up considerable interest. I think he would have probably gone down that route myself. There's definitely something there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so very much. And the name of the museum, Rebecca? The museum
Powell Cotton Museum.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
so the next question is from Benedetta Rossi. Benedetta wants to come on video, who teaches history of Africa at UCL and taught Rebecca.
Yeah.
So welcome, and very nice to see you, Benedetta.
Hi. I can't hear you.
You're muted.
Sorry.
Good.
Can you hear me now?
I can. Hi.
Well, first, hi, Rebecca. It's wonderful to hear your presentation. This was really fascinating, and it's great to see how wide-ranging and rich is the work you're doing now. So thanks for this. Just briefly, I wanted to push you a little bit about on how you interpret what these actors thought they were up to. So there was a quote by Torday where Torday is talking about this man who carved many of the objects he collected. I can't remember his name, I didn't write it down.
Lele, yeah.
Lele.
Yeah.
And the language that Torday is using is, suggests that he is taking at face value many of the ideas of the Congolese groups. So, he says that Lele wakes up after being dead for 2 days and does a number of things. He doesn't say this is what people believe. He tells the story in a very direct way. So on the one hand, how did Torday relate to these practices and these Congolese practices and ideas? What did they mean to him? What kind of phenomena did he think he was confronted with, he was engaging? And then on the other hand, what did people like Lele or his Congolese sort of interlocutors think they were doing when they were giving him objects that they carved to bring to Europe? Did they think they were giving him powerful magical objects for divination? Or, you know, do you have any insights into how the two sides to this relation, Torday on one side and the Congolese persons interacted with, what they thought they were up to as they exchanged these objects? What did these objects mean to them?
Yeah. Okay, amazing questions. Thank you for those. Yeah, so with regards to Lele and Torday sort of buying into these ideas himself, I did leave off quite a sarcastic comment at the end of that quote, which said, I admire his cleverness. So, but in the more sort of popular accounts and in some of the unpublished accounts, Torday seems to be grappling with what he saw and witnessed in an empirical sense and what actually works and functions, and notions of spirits, and perhaps he bought into some of those practices a little more than his popular accounts would believe. And then he struggled to marry that up, I think, in his later life, in his more theoretical works. So I feel like he was trying to squeeze quite broad and complicated categories into quite tight anthropological theoretical categories for European audiences. And I think perhaps that's one of the reasons that he's been left out of the mainstay of anthropology, because he stayed a little bit too much within the other camp, if you like. There is a sort of private note as well in one of Torday's 1925 publications, Causerie Congolaise, that says that basically, in essence, that the work he's writing is just a guise to almost play along with the fact that he's part of this colonial system, that he buys into the same belief systems as Europeans, but in fact he's trying to instruct them as to how things actually work in context. So he prided himself on that, really. And I think, like Torday, I've struggled to fit his work into a bracket as well. I think he struggled to fit, you know, to meld together his empirical fieldwork and theory. And on the Congo side, as in what they were doing, that's actually a huge question, because it depends on where they were in the expedition and who he was with. So this is actually the bit we've looked at today is a really, really rare part of the expedition, where Torday used these kind of ad hoc so-called bushcraft techniques. What I was trying to pull out is that Torday had enough background knowledge to make that work in a more sophisticated way than has been acknowledged in the wider literature. But elsewhere, like in the Royal Kuba capital, where Torday collected royal sculptures and recorded in great detail oral testimonies that still stand in Congo and outside to this day as at least valid transcriptions, with all the complications that come along with oral testimonies, obviously. Objects were given away with their power enforced into them in order to stand up tall in the colonial regime. And in that particular area, for example, Jan Vensina gives great agency to both Torday and the objects that he collected in the maintenance of the Kuba Empire, which is one of the only African empires to still stand throughout colonialism and still stands to this day. I hope that answers your questions somewhat.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Really. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Blair Rutherford, who is an anthropologist at Carleton University, and Blair will come on video to ask it. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dominique, and many thanks, Rebecca. Really enjoyed your talk. very, very rich and wonderful to see you again on the other side of the ocean, so to speak.
Yeah.
So thank you for giving a talk in the Institute. It's great. And I kind of picking up on the other side maybe of Benedetta's good question and Emilia's question, wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the guidelines given to him by the museum to what he was looking for to collect. And was it for ritualistic objects, or what were they fetishizing, so to speak, those type of objects, or were any of the objects he sent back ever rejected because it didn't fit within the museum mandate? And just kind of, as you're, when you're responding to Benedetta, you're talking about his perhaps his, recognition of being in the colonial system and so forth, and how he translated that in the actual material practices of collecting.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So in terms of guidelines set out in notes and queries, again, it's that Torday really struggled, actually. A lot of the formulated questionnaires were sent back to the museum. I've got copies of those. And many of the categories were sort of empty. And then some of them were sort of crammed full of information. So I think Torday, again, was struggling to marry up this practical experience, what he was seeing, witnessing, hearing in terms of Indigenous terminology, and then squeezing it into these museological categories. And the same can be said with ethnic labels, and that sort of museum, that one tribe, one style type museological push. That just doesn't marry up at all to huge trade networks in both divination practices, theory, spiritual understandings of the world. So what I'd like to look at this in more detail, but I did notice as well that Torday's field notes, they're written very, very fluidly, like without categories, but alongside in red pen. Joyce at the museum has slotted different categories alongside, so he'll write marriage, folklore. Oh, now we're back to chieftaincy. Oh, now we're back to the Queen Mother. Okay, now we're, objects, art, and they're all intertwined in context and then separated back out. The large anthropological tome was published very, very quickly in 1910 after the expedition returned, which is, a huge testament to the fact that these ideas were being sent back and forth. What's really quite unfortunate, I think, is that we don't have any of Joyce's correspondence out to Torday, because I think that would have told us a little bit more about what Torday was doing in the field, and how the theory back home was shaping his vision of what he was encountering empirically as well. He was sent a few books, and he requested a few books to be sent out. And of course, mission stations and colonial officers also did have maps, books and so on, and different theories. So there is that sort of melding of empiricism and theory within the field, that kind of diachronic action, I think. Yeah.
Wonderful, thanks. So very, you have such rich material, and looking
really
forward.
Is, yeah, it's overwhelming.
I can imagine. Yeah, no, looking forward to reading more from you.
Okay, in the absence of do you? Oh, there you go. We have a question from Joanne. Whoops, there's something strange happening here. Do you see me?
I can see you still.
Okay, there's something strange, like I don't see myself. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but Joanne is asking a question. Joanne, would you like to come on? Yeah, she wants to come on video to ask you the further questions. So there you go, Joanne.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominique.
Very nice.
Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Becky. Okay. Thank you.
With you, is it?
Sorry? Yeah, it's about 3 a.m. over here.
Thank you for staying. Yeah.
No problem. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Okay. All right. Thank you, Rebecca, for that absolutely fascinating piece, and thank you also for letting us know further insights as to Torday's mind and what he was struggling with, which is something that made me quite curious, because do you have any insight on the actual source of his struggle? Because do you have accounts that he actually witnessed something, as you said, cognitively puzzling, that sort of made him think, okay, what I'm witnessing is seriously something that needs to be reckoned with and does not quite fit with the empirical viewpoint? Or did the struggle come about by him believing in the veracity of the local accounts, or did he already carry his own set of spiritual viewpoint into the field, and therefore it sort of seems to gel, but yet, as an academic, it was hard to resolve, especially when he's thinking of possibly the audience that he's writing for and the audience that he will be reporting to back home in the museums and all that. So I was wondering if you can expound a little bit on that.
Well, yeah, I was really interested actually in his own spiritual background. I'll start there. The short answer is, like, I can't really decipher where he stood. And about halfway through my PhD, we found out that Torday was Jewish. So I started looking into this sort of Jewish mysticism and things like that to see in the Old Testament and divination practices there too. And I think there may be some kind of interesting link there, but I can't figure out whether Torday identified himself, because he changed his name from Boom to Torday. But this was quite a common practice for secular Jews in Hungary at the time. So I don't know if he identified as Jewish to the companions on his expedition or anyone else in England. I thought about maybe looking up some Jewish cemeteries in London to see where he's buried. So I might follow that line. And in his 1925 publication, I noticed that he's actually extremely worldly in terms of his understanding of spirituality and religions. And he had a great relationship, undoubtedly, with the King Kwete in the Kuba Empire. They were, there's no dispute that they were very close. They exchanged objects, they didn't sell them. He was initiated into some quite high ranks as well. So even beneath the rhetoric, there was certainly something there with them. And he compares him to the Buddha.
Who compares who to the Buddha?
Huh?
Who compares who to the Buddha?
Torday compares the king to the Buddha.
Ooh.
And in the spiritual living link. So there's some. And he also compares one of the souls to the Ida in Egypt and things like that. So there is some like real worldly insight into the spiritual practices that Gel taps into, really. In terms of, did he witness anything, that was completely alarming? I'm not too sure. But the way he tries to describe Kasai, I mean, I couldn't really get into it today, but it's so patchy. It's so all over the place. It's like he was waiting for Gel's theory or something similar to be able to kind of say, oh, okay, this is what it's about. I think he was just sort of building up to those ideas, to be honest. And had he survived a little longer, does that answer your question, Joe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, I wouldn't expect that, unless you have accounts of something really being definitive about where his source of struggle comes from. I suppose what you have explained just now would be anyone's speculation as well, and I think it's fair. I think it's a fair read on him.
Right.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
So Joe, as she said in the chat box, is a former colleague of Rebecca. They studied at the same place, they researched at the same place in the UK. Fine, so I'll take the privilege of the chair to ask you the last question, Rebecca, before we leave. you showed us extraordinary documents, that these field notes, volumes of them with these marvelous pictures and annotations, and as you said to Blair, these comprehensive, almost literary accounts of what he found. And then you spoke of this unpublished manuscript of tales. And I was wondering if in the horizon, amongst the people who hold that collection, I think it's at the Royal Anthropological Society, are there any wish to publish some of these documents, to put some of them online, and even like they're doing here at Library and Archives Canada, to bring back some of these pictures to the communities where they were taken, to have some work of identification and reappropriation of all the stuff that is in there amongst the local communities?
That would be great. I think a lot of it has been digitized, but I'm not sure. It's not public access. And I was going to mention to you as well, there's some archival material relating to the Save the Children International. I think you've probably seen that. But I do agree with you that I think publishing it in its raw form and making it accessible would go a long way for the study of African history and the history of anthropology. But currently, no, there's no plans there. I'd like to go back to Kikwit, where Torday lived for a number of years, and he's still remembered there. It was one of my favourite towns in the DRC. Yeah, I absolutely loved it. And there's some really good local historians as well that can give all sorts of insights. Yeah, I think you asked me before actually about what I'd learnt there, and one of the things that was interesting was that the colonial William Parmenter, who owned Société Anonyme Belge, which was like a branch of the Lever soap industries over there, his grave, I was taken to his grave, and the current president, I was told, goes and takes some of the dirt from the grave and takes it back to Kinshasa. So it kind of linked into this idea of Kisi and this harnessing of power. I also had a tour around the museum where I was told very much that objects did have a life, and that they watched over people, and this was something that Torday himself witnessed and experienced, and also appropriated objects to do the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. So before we thank Rebecca, I would like, as you see on your screen, to invite you same day, same time in February and March to the two last brown bag lectures, one on a Nigerian biography by an independent historian based in Ottawa, Ana Luisa de Oliveira de Silva, and another one by an international relations specialist, John Kostopoulos, on Africa and EU relations. But most of all, thank you so very much, Rebecca, for a wonderful and spectacular presentation on the work of this extraordinary man. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting me. It's been great. And thanks for everyone for coming too.